The heavy steel door slammed shut, leaving her in pitch black with the low, guttural growl of a 100-pound German shepherd trained to tear flesh from bone. The corrupt warden smiled, waiting for her screams. He didn't know the woman inside wasn't just a prisoner. She was a lethal weapon. The dusty roads of Oak Ridge County, nestled deep in the forgotten foothills of upstate New York, were infamous for two things: blinding summer heat and a local law enforcement system that operated like a private cartel. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Higgins didn't know this, nor did she care. She was just passing through. At 34 years old, Sarah had spent the last 12 years of her life in the shadows. As one of the few women to successfully integrate into the elite echelons of the United States Naval Special Warfare Development Group, commonly known as SEAL Team 6, her life had been a blur of classified deployments across the Middle East and North Africa. She was currently on a mandatory 4-week leave, following a grueling, highly classified extraction mission in Syria. All she wanted was to drive her vintage 1978 Ford Bronco across the country, listen to classic rock, and forget the smell of cordite for a few days. But Oak Ridge County had other plans. The flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror just as she crossed the town limit. Sarah checked her speedometer. She was going exactly 45 miles per hour in a 45 zone. Her hands, calloused and scarred from years of tactical rope work and weapons training, calmly moved to the 10-2 position on the steering wheel. She pulled over onto the gravel shoulder, turned off the engine, and rolled down the window. Deputy Greg Collins approached the vehicle with a swagger that spoke volumes about his fragile ego. He was a broad-shouldered man with a sunburned neck, his hand resting aggressively on the butt of his service weapon. "License and registration," Collins barked, not bothering with a greeting. "Afternoon, officer," Sarah said, her voice even completely devoid of the nervous flutter cops were used to hearing. She handed him her driver's license. Collins sneered at it. "You're a long way from home, Higgins. Mind telling me why you were swerving back there?" "I wasn't swerving, Deputy. I've maintained my lane for the last 40 miles, she replied smoothly. Collins leaned into the window, smelling of stale coffee and chewing tobacco. "Are you arguing with me, girl? Step out of the vehicle." Sarah knew the game. She had faced down heavily armed insurgents in Fallujah. A power-tripping county deputy wasn't going to make her pulse rise above 60 beats per minute. She stepped out of the truck slowly, keeping her hands visible. Without warning, Collins grabbed her shoulder and shoved her hard against the side of the Bronco. "I said hands on the vehicle." Every instinct in Sarah's highly trained nervous system screamed at her to pivot, sweep his leg, and neutralize the threat. It would take her exactly 1.4 seconds to disarm him and lay him unconscious in the dirt, but doing so would blow her cover, violate her oath, and drag the Navy into a civilian legal nightmare. She swallowed her pride and let him pat her down. "What do we have here?" Collins grunted, pulling a heavy canvas duffel bag from her back seat. "That is my personal property," Sarah warned, her tone shifting slightly, dropping an octave into a cold, hard register. "I do not consent to a search." "I smell contraband." Collins lied effortlessly, unzipping the bag. He didn't find drugs. What he found was a locked steel lockbox. "Open it." "No," Sarah said simply. Infuriated by her calm defiance, Collins slammed the handcuffs onto her wrists, ratcheting them tight enough to cut off her circulation. "Sarah Higgins, you are under arrest for suspicion of transporting contraband and resisting a lawful order." Within an hour, Sarah was processed into the Oak Ridge County Correctional Facility, a grim, brutalist concrete fortress surrounded by razor wire. The facility was run by Warden Arthur Pendleton, a man who treated the prison as his own personal fiefdom. Pendleton was notoriously corrupt, allegedly taking kickbacks from private prison contractors and using inmates for free labor. When Sarah was brought into the booking area, Pendleton happened to be reviewing the intake logs. He was a tall, skeletal man with cold, watery blue eyes and a tailored suit that cost more than a correctional officer's monthly salary. "What do we have here, Deputy?" Pendleton asked, looking Sarah up and down with open disdain. "Out-of-stater. Refused a search. Gave me lip on the highway," Collins said, tossing Sarah's locked steel box onto the warden's desk. "Says she's in the Navy, but she ain't acting like any sailor I ever met." Pendleton scoffed, picking up Sarah's civilian ID. "Navy? What do you do, sweetheart? Type memos for the admirals?" Sarah stood perfectly straight, ignoring the throbbing pain in her wrists. "I am requesting my one phone call, Warden, and I am advising you that opening that box is a violation of federal law." Pendleton laughed a dry, raspy sound. He grabbed a crowbar from a tool bench in the corner of the intake room. "In my prison, I am the federal law." He jammed the crowbar into the lockbox in pride. The cheap civilian lock snapped. Inside, however, there were no drugs or money. There were only folded, heavily redacted documents bearing the Department of Defense seal, a dress uniform neatly folded, and a small, velvet-lined mahogany box. Pendleton didn't bother opening the velvet box. He was annoyed that he hadn't found anything he could seize for cash. He threw the papers onto the floor, put her in holding. Let's see if a few days on concrete softens up her attitude. As the guards dragged her away, Sarah looked back at her belongings, scattered on the dirty linoleum floor. She didn't say a word, but her eyes locked onto Pendleton's. It was the dead, hollow stare of an apex predator. Pendleton felt a sudden, inexplicable chill run down his spine, but he quickly brushed it off. He had no idea he had just locked a caged tiger in a room made of paper. For 48 hours, Sarah Higgins sat in a standard holding cell, completely unbothered. While other inmates cried, shouted, or banged on the bars, Sarah sat in the center of the floor in a cross-legged, meditative stance. She used the time to regulate her breathing, run mental tactical drills, and preserve her energy. Up in his office, Warden Pendleton watched her on the security monitors. It was driving him insane. Pendleton was a man who thrived on fear. He broke people. He loved the moment when a tough, arrogant inmate finally cracked, begged for mercy, or shed tears. But this woman, this random out-of-towner, was completely immune to the psychological pressure of the facility. She didn't eat the slop they served. She didn't flinch when the guards banged their batons against her bars, and she slept soundly despite the freezing temperatures of the cell. "She thinks she's better than us," Pendleton muttered to Deputy Collins, who was lounging on the leather sofa in the office. "Just leave her in there," Collins shrugged. "She'll break by day 4. They always do." "No," Pendleton said, his eyes narrowing maliciously. "I want her broken today. Move her to the hole, and tell Miller to prep Brutus." Collins sat up, his face paling slightly. "Brutus? Boss, that dog is a liability. You know what he did to the last guy we put in there. Ripped his calf muscle, clean off the bone. We barely covered it up. She resisted arrest and became violent," Pendleton stated, rehearsing the lie smoothly. "We had to deploy the K9 to subdue her. It's perfectly legal. Do it." Down in the lower levels of the prison, the guards came for Sarah. They pulled her up, cuffed her hands behind her back, and marched her down a long, flickering corridor that smelled of rust and bleach. They threw her into a solid concrete cell, the Hole. It was an isolation room used for violent offenders, devoid of a bed, a toilet, or any natural light. A few minutes later, the heavy outer door groaned open, but the barred inner door remained locked. Through the steel grate, Sarah could see the shadows of 2 men. One was Warden Pendleton. The other was a nervous-looking guard, Officer Miller, who was struggling to hold back a massive, terrifying creature. It was a German shepherd, but it looked more like a wolf. Brutus weighed 110 pounds, his fur jet black and dark tan, his muscles coiled like steel springs. He was barking furiously, saliva flying from his jaws, his paws tearing at the concrete floor as he lunged toward Sarah's scent. "You like dogs, Higgins?" Pendleton taunted through the bars. "Brutus here has a bit of an anger problem. We usually use him for riot control, but I figure a few minutes in there with him might teach you some respect for my authority." Sarah stood in the center of the cell, her feet shoulder-width apart. She didn't retreat to the corner. She didn't raise her hands to protect her face. She just stared at the dog. During her time in DevGru, Sarah had cross-trained extensively with the military's elite K9 units. She had worked alongside dogs that dropped out of helicopters and cleared explosive-laden compounds in pitch darkness. She understood K9 psychology better than most handlers. She could see instantly that Brutus wasn't a properly trained police dog. He was an abused animal, made vicious through fear and poor handling by Miller. "Warden," Sarah said, her voice echoing in the concrete chamber, dead calm. "If you open that door, you are going to lose your dog." Pendleton laughed. It was the arrogant bark of a man who thought he held all the cards. "Open it," he snapped at Miller. Miller hesitated. "Warden, she's unarmed. I said open the damn door. Miller unclipped the padlock and slid the heavy barred door open. He unhooked the thick leather leash. Get him, Brutus! The massive dog exploded into the cell like a furry missile, his jaws snapping, a terrifying growl vibrating from his chest. He closed the distance in a fraction of a second, leaping directly for Sarah's throat. Pendleton smiled, waiting for the blood, but it never came. In a move so fast the warden barely processed it, Sarah didn't back away. She stepped into the dog's attack. She raised her left forearm, wrapped in the thick fabric of her prison-issued jumpsuit, offering it as a bite sleeve. As Brutus's jaws clamped down on her arm, she didn't scream or pull away, which would have triggered the dog's prey drive to tear. Instead, she pushed her arm forcefully into the back of his mouth, gagging him, while simultaneously grabbing the scruff of his neck with her right hand. Then, tapping into the deep, authoritative alpha resonance she had perfected in combat zones, she barked a command in flawless, booming German, the language used for high-level tactical K9s. Aus! Out. Release. The sheer volume and absolute dominance in her voice shocked the animal. Brutus released his grip out of pure instinct. Before the dog could recover, Sarah forced him down, pressing her body weight against his shoulders, pinning him to the concrete without striking him. She leaned directly into his face, her eyes locking onto his, entirely unafraid, establishing absolute pack dominance. Plats! Down, she roared, pointing a single, rigid finger at the floor. Brutus whimpered. The terrifying man-eating beast of Oak Ridge County Correctional suddenly recognized that he was not the apex predator in the room. He dropped his belly to the cold concrete, flattened his ears, and tucked his tail between his legs, panting submissively. Sarah stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving the dog. Bleeb, stay, she whispered. Brutus didn't move a muscle. The silence in the corridor was deafening. Warden Pendleton's smug smile had vanished, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. Officer Miller's jaw was practically touching the floor. Sarah turned slowly to face the bars, her left sleeve torn, but her skin miraculously unbroken, save for a few bruises. Her gaze locked onto Pendleton's, burning with a cold, righteous fury. You don't know the first thing about discipline, Warden, Sarah said softly, her voice carrying the lethal promise of a ticking bomb. But you're about to learn. Warden Arthur Pendleton didn't say a word. He couldn't. His mouth opened and closed like a dying fish as he stared through the heavy steel grate at the impossible scene unfolding in the hole. The beast that had terrorized the Oak Ridge County Correctional Facility for 3 years, a dog that had sent grown men to the intensive care unit, was currently resting his massive, lethal jaw on the knee of a woman in a bright orange jumpsuit. Sarah reached down, her movements deliberately slow, and scratched Brutus behind the ears. The dog leaned into her touch, a low rumbling groan of contentment vibrating from his chest. Panic, hot and acidic, finally broke through Pendleton's shock. He slammed his hand against the control panel, sliding the solid steel outer door shut with a deafening crash, plunging the cell back into total darkness. Warden? Officer Miller stammered, backing away from the door as if the ghost of the Grim Reaper himself might phase through the metal. What the hell was that? Who is she? Shut up, Miller! Pendleton hissed, wiping a bead of cold sweat from his forehead. He practically sprinted down the corridor, his expensive leather shoes echoing off the damp concrete. Leave her down there. Nobody goes in. Nobody feeds her. She doesn't exist until I figure out what to do. Pendleton retreated to his office, locked the door, and poured himself a heavy glass of cheap bourbon. His hands were shaking. He walked over to his desk and stared at the scattered, redacted papers he had tossed on the floor 48 hours ago. He bent down, picked one up, and finally looked at it closely. The letterhead bore the official seal of the United States Department of Defense. Below it, a line read, Naval Special Warfare Command, Detachment Alpha, Clearance Level, Top Secret, SCI. Just a typist, he whispered to himself, trying to maintain his delusion. She's just a pencil pusher who knows how to handle a dog. But 400 miles away, at the Naval Amphibious Base, Little Creek in Virginia, the gears of a massive, unstoppable machine were already turning. Chief Petty Officer Sarah Higgins was a Tier 1 operator attached to DevGru. When you exist in that incredibly rare, lethal atmosphere of the military, you do not simply go off the grid. Even on mandatory leave, operators are required to ping a secure geolocator beacon through their encrypted cell phones every 48 hours. It was a strict protocol implemented by the Pentagon to prevent active assets from being kidnapped by foreign intelligence. At exactly 1,400 hours on Tuesday, Sarah's beacon missed its ping. Inside the Tactical Operations Center at Little Creek, a red light blinked on the monitor of Petty Officer First Class David Thorne. He immediately escalated the anomaly to Captain Richard Hayes, the commanding officer of Sarah's squadron. "Captain, we have a missed check-in from Higgins," Thorne reported, his fingers flying across his mechanical keyboard. "Last known trajectory was upstate New York, heading west. Her transponder is dead, and her phone is going straight to a secure voicemail." Captain Hayes, a man whose face looked like it had been carved from granite, frowned. He knew Sarah Higgins. She was the most meticulous, disciplined operator in his unit. If she missed a check-in, she was either dead or someone was preventing her from communicating. "Run her plates through the National Crime Information Center," Hayes ordered. "Ping the joint automated booking system. Let's see if she got into a fender bender." 10 seconds later, Thorne swallowed hard. "Sir, she's in the system. Booked 48 hours ago in Oak Ridge County, New York. Charges listed as resisting arrest and transporting contraband. No bail set. She's currently in custody." Hayes's eyes narrowed. Did they notify the Judge Advocate General's Corps? Did they notify the Navy? "No, sir. Total radio silence from the local jurisdiction." Captain Hayes picked up a secure red telephone on his desk. He wasn't going to call the local sheriff. He wasn't going to call a lawyer. When a Tier 1 operator is illegally detained and effectively held hostage by a rogue local jurisdiction, it becomes a federal matter of national security. Hayes bypassed the standard chain of command and placed a direct call to the United States Attorney General's office, looping in the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Christopher Wray, and the commander of the FBI's Elite Hostage Rescue Team, HRT, stationed out of Quantico. "Director," Hayes said, his voice deadly calm. "One of my best operators is being held completely incommunicado by a county warden in upstate New York. Given the classified intelligence currently resting in her brain, I consider her a compromised asset in a hostile environment. I want her out. Now." Within 2 hours, a convoy of matte black Chevrolet Suburbans, flanked by armored Bearcat tactical vehicles, roared out of the FBI field office in Albany. Above them, 2 Sikorsky UH-60 Blackhawk helicopters chopped through the humid afternoon air, bypassing standard flight corridors to make a direct line for Oak Ridge County. Back in the prison, Arthur Pendleton was frantically feeding documents into a paper shredder. The realization that he had illegally imprisoned a high-level federal asset was finally beginning to pierce his arrogance. He planned to release her that night, delete her booking file, and claim it was a clerical error. He never got the chance. The heavy thud of helicopter rotors shook the windows of the warden's office. Pendleton dropped his files and rushed to the glass. Outside, hovering just 50 feet above the prison's recreation yard, were 2 black military helicopters. Armed men in tactical olive drab gear were fast roping down into the yard. At the same exact moment, the front gates of the facility were violently rammed open by a reinforced Bearcat, crushing the steel barrier like tinfoil. Dozens of federal agents in full tactical body armor, bearing the letters FBI in bold yellow, swarmed the compound. Deputy Greg Collins, who had been lounging at the front desk, stood up and unholstered his weapon. "Hey, you can't just barge in." Before Collins could finish his sentence, 3 red laser sights painted his chest. A heavily armed FBI HRT operator stepped forward, a customized M4 carbine leveled directly at the deputy's face. "Drop the weapon, kick it away, and get on the ground," the operator ordered. His voice left zero room for negotiation. Collins dropped his gun and fell to his knees, sobbing immediately. The front doors of the prison shattered open, and Captain Richard Hayes strode into the lobby, flanked by Special Agent in Charge Michael Vance of the FBI. Hayes wasn't wearing tactical gear. He was wearing his pristine Navy service dress blue uniform, his chest adorned with ribbons. The contrast between the immaculate military commander and the dingy, corrupt prison lobby was absolute. "Where's the warden?" Hayes demanded, his voice echoing off the cheap tile. Pendleton, pale and trembling, walked slowly out of his office, his hands raised slightly. I am the warden. What is the meaning of this? You have no jurisdiction." Agent Vance stepped forward, flashing a federal warrant signed by a federal judge just 30 minutes prior. Arthur Pendleton, You are under arrest for federal civil rights violations, kidnapping, and the illegal detainment of a United States military asset. Hands behind your back." "Kidnapping?" Pendleton shrieked as two massive federal agents slammed him against the wall and wrenched his arms backward. "She was speeding! She resisted arrest!" Captain Hayes stepped so close to Pendleton that the corrupt warden could smell the starch on the Navy uniform. "Where is she?" Pendleton's bravado shattered. "In the basement. Solitary confinement. Cell 4. The descent into the lower levels of the Oak Ridge facility felt like walking into a medieval dungeon. Captain Hayes, Agent Vance, and a squad of tactical operators moved down the flickering corridors, the stench of mildew and fear heavy in the air. They dragged Pendleton with them, forcing the warden to walk at the front of the formation. When they reached the heavy steel door of Cell 4, Hayes commanded Pendleton to unlock it. I can't," Pendleton stuttered, staring at the floor. "Unlock the damn door, Warden," Agent Vance snapped. "You don't understand," Pendleton whispered, genuine terror in his eyes. "I put the dog in there with her. Brutus. He's a killer. If you open that door, he's going to maul whoever steps inside." Hayes didn't even blink. He shoved Pendleton aside and grabbed the heavy iron latch himself. With a massive heave, the captain threw the solid outer door open, immediately stepping back as the tactical operators raised their weapons, preparing to neutralize a vicious animal. Agent Vance clicked on a high-powered tactical flashlight, cutting through the pitch-black darkness of the hole. The beam of light illuminated the center of the room. There, sitting cross-legged on the cold, unforgiving concrete, was Chief Petty Officer Sarah Higgins. Her bright orange jumpsuit was dirty, and the left sleeve was torn, revealing a massive purpling bruise on her forearm. And right beside her, resting his large, terrifying head peacefully on her lap, was Brutus. The 110-pound attack dog blinked in the bright light, letting out a soft whine, but made no move to attack. Sarah was gently stroking his fur. She looked up at the blinding flashlight, squinting slightly. "You're late, Captain." Captain Hayes let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The stern lines of his face softened into a rare, genuine smile. "Apologies, Chief. Traffic on the I-95 was a nightmare." "I see you brought the cavalry," Sarah said, slowly standing up. As she moved, she patted her leg. "Here," she commanded softly. Brutus immediately stood and glued himself to her left side, sitting in a perfect, disciplined heel position. The FBI operators slowly lowered their weapons, staring in absolute awe at the woman who had somehow tamed the prison's most violent weapon in pitch darkness. "Let's get you out of here, Sarah," Hayes said. They walked back up to the main booking area, which was now completely under federal control. Local deputies were sitting on the floor in zip ties, while federal agents seized computers, filing cabinets, and security footage. The decades-long reign of corruption in Oak Ridge County was being dismantled in a matter of hours. As they entered the main office, Sarah stopped. She saw her canvas duffel bag sitting on a table next to the broken steel lockbox Pendleton had pried open. "Chief Higgins," Agent Vance said, retrieving the small, velvet-lined mahogany box from the pile of scattered belongings. "I believe this is yours." Sarah took the box. She looked over at Pendleton, who was handcuffed to a steel bench, watching her with a mixture of hatred and profound confusion. "You asked what I do in the Navy, Warden," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the noise of the busy room. "You asked if I was a typist." She clicked the brass latch of the velvet box and opened it. The fluorescent lights of the prison lobby caught the polished metal inside, reflecting a blinding, golden gleam. Inside the box rested 3 items, nestled in pristine black velvet. The first was the Purple Heart, its deep violet ribbon contrasting sharply against the gold profile of George Washington. The second was the Silver Star Medal, the United States Armed Forces' 3rd highest personal decoration for valor in combat. It was awarded to Sarah for running through heavy machine gun fire in the streets of Raqqa to drag 2 wounded Marines to safety, neutralizing 4 insurgents with her sidearm in the process. But it was the third item that drew the eyes of every federal agent and military officer in the room. It was a heavy gold pin featuring an eagle clutching a trident, a flintlock pistol, and an anchor. The Special Warfare Insignia. The Seal Trident. A heavy, reverent silence fell over the room. Even the hardened FBI, HRT operators stood a little straighter. They knew exactly what that piece of metal meant. It meant the woman standing in front of them had survived the most brutal, psychologically devastating military training on the planet, and had proven herself in the deadliest corners of the earth. Pendleton stared at the medals, his face draining of whatever color it had left. The sheer magnitude of his mistake finally crushed him. He hadn't just arrested a random civilian. He had caged an apex predator, a decorated American hero who possessed the training to kill every man in that building, yet had chosen the path of incredible, superhuman restraint. I didn't know, Pendleton whispered, his voice cracking. It was a pathetic, empty excuse. That's the problem with men like you, Sarah said coldly, snapping the velvet box shut. You rely on the dark to make yourselves feel powerful, but you forget that some of us were trained to own the dark. She turned away from him, slinging her canvas bag over her shoulder. She looked down at Brutus, who was still sitting obediently by her side, looking up at her with loyal, intelligent eyes. Captain, Sarah said, looking at Hayes, the local jurisdiction is going to euthanize this animal. They abused him, trained him poorly, and turned him into a weapon. I want him. Hayes looked at the massive German shepherd, then back to his top operator. I'll have JAG draft the asset seizure paperwork immediately. He's federal property now. Sarah smiled for the first time in 3 days. She opened the front door of the prison, stepping out into the warm, golden afternoon sun. The air smelled like pine trees and freedom. She walked toward her vintage Ford Bronco, which the FBI had politely parked in the VIP spot, with a massive lethal shadow trotting happily at her heels. Behind her, the corrupt empire of Oak Ridge County burned to the ground, extinguished by the quiet, unbreakable discipline of a single Navy SEAL. True strength doesn't need to scream. It whispers in the dark and refuses to break. Sarah's incredible restraint and ultimate victory prove that true heroes walk among us, quietly carrying the weight of their sacrifices. If this story of justice, military honor, and karma gave you chills, make sure to hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a brilliant comeback, and subscribe for more real-life stories of unstoppable courage. Stay strong, and we'll see you next time.